Hello and welcome to Celebration Bar Review. My name is Jackson Mumey, and this is a continuing series about myths about the bar review. Our last message was, in our countdown of 10 myths, was It's All About Me. And today I want to look at myth number 9, although I will have to tell you they're not really in any particular order. These could all be number 1 myths, depending on how you're approaching your bar exam. But myth number 9 to me is the one that I hear frequently from people, and it's that question practice is all that really matters when you're preparing for the exam. It's all about the questions. It's doing more questions. Now, on its face, that sounds like a pretty reasonable statement. I mean, the more questions you practice, it should be that the better you do on your exam. The problem really has to do with several different layers, I guess. The first thing to ask is, what questions are you doing? Very often when I hear from someone who says that they're going to do question practice, it's in the context of the multi-state bar, the MBE. And typically I hear this from a student who has taken one of those 3-day or 6-day courses or intends to do so. And in that particular course, at least for many years now, they've been taught that you're supposed to do 50 questions a day or 50 questions a night. Now, any rational person would ask themselves, why 50? What's wrong with 45? Or if 50 is good, aren't 100 better? So it's a pretty arbitrary number. I will tell you that based on my experience and just sort of generally talking to people in the industry over many, many years, I think the number 50 really came as a way to keep students busy when they weren't in the 3-day or 6-day course. In other words, it was more of a class management than a pedagogy approach. I found nothing magic about the number 50 in terms of number of questions, and so from that level, I think it's a pretty silly request to make. Secondly, you need to ask yourself, what are you going to do when you study these questions, whether it's 50 or 100 or whatever? And the answer is, it doesn't do you any good to do the questions unless you're reviewing the explanations to the answer choices. I think that that's particularly true with multi-state questions where you have separate multiple choices to look at. In a course like ours, you're going to look at answer explanations for every answer choice, and then you want to make some notes about what you missed and why, as well as looking at what you got correct. I think to just do the questions and say, well, I got this number correct, out of 100 I got 75 correct, or I got 50 correct, or whatever, is not a very meaningful measure or gauge. In addition to which, you've theoretically just studied the subject. That certainly doesn't tell you much. And if you're not doing the questions under time conditions, it doesn't tell you anything at all when it comes to multiple choice. When it comes to essay questions, the only real value that I see is if you're doing an essay question, when you're done, you need to review the substance of the work you just went over. The problem is that most people think that the way to do that is to look at a model or a sample answer, and that is really a dangerous thing to do. When it comes to writing essays, the worst place to look is a model or a sample answer because it hardly ever represents all of the possibilities or even the desirable possibilities or even the way your bar review is teaching you to write. Indeed, it's the most passive way to learn because you sit there and you read that answer and you say, well, I didn't quite say that, but I would have, or I intended to say that, or that's about what I had in mind. You see, it doesn't get you very much. You don't accomplish a whole lot when you're doing that. So the way you review the work is as important as the work you do. So that's the second part of the problem. The third part of the problem is, what questions are you actually doing? And this is really a big issue when it comes to the multi-state bar. You see, not all multi-state questions are the same. There are courses that have licensed multi-state questions. We're one of them. We pay a royalty to the National Conference of Bar Examiners, and in exchange for that, we are licensed to provide past questions and to draft answers and explanations for those. Now, that's an expensive proposition, and for large bar review courses, it's so expensive that they simply choose not to do so. In fact, there are some courses that just go to faraway places and try and stuff the questions in their pants, but that's a whole different lawsuit. The point is that many of the large bar reviews write their own questions. Now you say, well, a question's a question, isn't it? But to paraphrase Freud, sometimes a bar question is more than a bar question. You see, there are different degrees of difficulty. There are different approaches. There are different ways of drafting a question. It's not easy to write a good question. That's why the National Conference goes through all the effort to create practice or pre-test questions before they become real live questions. It's hard to do good testing of questions. It's hard to get the right psychometric approach and consistency and reliability to a question. So when you try to write your own questions, when you throw a bunch of editors in a room and you say, quick, make me 250 contracts questions, you're going to get 250 pretty crazy questions. And the problem is that doesn't do you very much good when it comes to preparing for a specific test. So the reality is that most of the people doing those 50 questions a night are working with questions that are either harder than the actual exam or in some cases easier than the actual exam. The theory behind that, I guess, has been that if you get some that are harder and some that are easier, on average you'll be okay, which I often say is like putting your head in the refrigerator and your feet in the oven and saying that on average you should be comfortable. Doesn't quite work, does it? You see, I think you need to work with the real thing. Now, the real thing doesn't mean you're going to see those questions on the exam. No matter what anybody tells you, that isn't going to happen. No one does that unless they'd like to go to federal court and be sued for copyright infringement. So get that out of your head. It doesn't exist. But the idea of using licensed questions from prior exams is that you do see the tone, the structure, the principles of law that are being tested, the approach that's being used. I would tell you the same thing is true when it comes to essay questions or performance tests. If you can use prior questions, it's far better than if you've got made-up questions. And so you've got to look at the quality of the questions you're using. In our course, that's what we use, prior questions. We found it works much, much better. Well, why is it bad then to just say doing more questions isn't going to get you better? I guess for me, it comes to the idea of really this three-legged stool of studying, or the balance that you want. In our course, the stool is made up of the leg of doing your reading, the second leg is listening to the lecture on that material, and the third leg is doing question practice. You see, the idea is that I want you to engage your visual senses first in reading. I then want you to engage the oral senses, the ear senses, if you will, audio senses in listening, and maybe taking some notes. And then I want you to engage the synaptic responses in your brain when it comes to dealing with hypotheticals and fact patterns and problems. In other words, putting the law in context. If you do all three of those things, statistically, we know you're going to do much better in retaining information. Now note, that's not memorizing, but retaining the information and being able to use it, which is really the skill that I think is being tested, whether you're in an essay or a multiple choice exam. The idea here is you need to stay in balance. So the myth becomes dangerous because if you start doing question practice to the exclusion of reading or lectures or keeping in balance, you're going to get that stool out of proportion, out of balance, and you'll tip over. Doing question practice by itself isn't bad, but it has to be productive, it has to be deliberate, it has to be focused on specific tasks, and it needs to be in balance. If you're not doing those things, or if you're working with bad subject matter or bad material, you're really wasting your time, and that's why this is such a dangerous myth. So if you find yourself saying, you know what I'm going to do to prepare for the bar is just try a bunch of practice questions. I'll write essays all day. I got to tell you, your hand will cramp, you'll become crabby, and you won't have learned very much. And that's a very bad combination for you, your bar studies, your ultimate bar score, and everybody that's got to put up with you. I hope you'll think a little bit about that and think about whether or not the course you're taking or the approach that you're taking is balanced. Does it put question practice in the proper perspective? And are the questions that I'm looking at questions that are really going to help me when it comes to learning how to write an essay, how to do a performance test, how to take the MBE or the state practice multiple choice? All of those things are considerations as you consider myth number 9 about question practice. I hope that's helpful to you, and as always, I look forward to your comments and feedback. Enjoy hearing from you wherever you might be in whatever exam you're taking. And next week, we will be back with myth number 8 in our series of 10, and look forward to having a good study week. Thanks so much, and appreciate you watching and listening tonight.